Hi, everyone. My name is Vivian Schick, Senior Director of Marketing for HULFT, a comprehensive data logistics platform, and I'll be your moderator for the next 30 minutes. And I want to welcome everyone to today's presentation on achieving business process automation. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us. So joining us today is our Senior Director of Professional Services, Kevin O'Brien. Kevin is who I call a veteran database expert. For the last 20 plus years, he has been leading customer projects on data integration and middleware initiatives. As you might be able to tell later from his accent, he hails from a town called Plymouth, which is located in the southwestern part of England, and is a lifelong fan of his hometown soccer team, the Plymouth Argyle. During this presentation, Kevin will be addressing some of the common pain points we hear from customers around automation initiatives, such as doing something while existing and using legacy systems, projects that stay on time and on budget, and projects that take a realistic and scalable approach. In the next few minutes or so, he'll explain how all of you can solve for these pain points, especially as COVID-19 is pushing organizations deeper into digital transformation and where remote work and deeper collaboration is essential. So before I begin, I'd like to just walk you through some housekeeping items. Any time during this presentation, you can submit your questions by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any point. We're launching a quick survey at the end, so please stay on and take that survey so we can improve our future webinars. On-demand recording and presentations will also be available later. As a reminder, this is the first of our 5-part digital transformation webinar series. Registration details will also be emailed to you after this webinar is over, so I hope you'll be joining us in the future in the coming weeks. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kevin.
Welcome everyone to our first webinar that we're running out of the US. So as Vivian mentioned, we're going to chat a little bit about automation and how that affects us in a digital transformation perspective. So to set the scene, I thought we'd just quickly mention what do we mean by automation in our perspective. So I have a little definition on the screen here, which says that automation is a technology by which a process or procedure is performed by minimal human assistance. And especially in an IT-centric world, digital transformation, that's a pretty reasonable definition, I think. All right, so next slide, please, Vivian. So commonly, some of the goals of taking on an automation process are looking to things like trying to increase productivity, trying to do more of something in the same amount of time, or attempting to improve quality of a process, reducing the number of exceptions that might occur, improving robustness and consistency. And then, of course, there's the human aspect, potentially reducing direct human labor costs and therefore expenses. And another aspect could be looking to replace human operators in tasks that require hard physical labor or require some sort of monotonous work. So next slide. So of course, whenever humans are involved in any type of process or change, there's going to be some sort of emotion involved. And typically, when it comes to automation, those tend to fall into 2 camps. The first camp is probably fear. So folks tend to worry about change. They might be looking at things like reduced income or loss of employment, as the automation might render their skills or experiences unnecessary. Again, they might fear, certain buzzwords that are going around, like robots and artificial intelligence and machine learning. They all can be scary concepts and make people think that they might become obsolete. That's one way that people might react to an approach of automation. Another way that folks might react is through taking it as an opportunity. They might be able to envision that automation would bring about the removal of tedious, repetitive tasks that they have to do. And that means that then they can focus on higher business value processes. Another thing that might come with automation as well is actually potential new categories of employment. So, for example, if you introduce robots into a manufacturing process, then you're probably going to need some sort of technician to manage the robots. So that's a whole new category of employment that ends up coming out of introducing automation. So from a personal perspective, think about the many ways that automation has benefited your daily life, both work life and domestic life. You know, you might have tasks where potentially you used a calculator in the past to go through and calculate some monthly figures. Typically today, people will probably approach that through something like Excel, which makes things much easier, and you don't have to you know, keep totals going. You can just put numbers in cells and they will calculate automatically. Another area in domestic life is think about a scrub board, which is kind of the old-fashioned way that folks used to wash clothes, as compared to a washing machine. I'm sure none of us would like to go back to the days where we had to use scrub boards. So bottom line, automation has been with us for a very long time, many centuries actually. But it started to become widespread around the era of the Industrial Revolution, the 1800s. But ever since then, it's really accelerated, and that hasn't stopped. It continues to accelerate to this day, and continues and will continue to accelerate. All right, next slide. So there are a couple of ways that you can approach an automation task. One way, specifically if the automation tends to be strategic, that typically is driven by the C-level executives. And that would be because quite often those involve large scope. They might well cross organizational boundaries, such as departments, regions, divisions, subsidiaries, even geographical locations. There's quite often a considerable cost involved, so there's an investment in people, processes, and technology to be able to take on that automation. Some examples of where you might see that. Let's consider a scenario where a decision is made to provide access to human capital information, so the human resources within an organization. I've worked in a couple of companies where that initiative has taken place. One was providing the information as a global employee directory, so that folks could go onto a website and look up specific people, obviously their names, their phone numbers, their emails, their job title, their office location, that type of information. So obviously that's got some relative sensitive information. So that was driven by the C-level execs to make sure that could be pushed across the entire company and controlled and secured in an appropriate manner. I've also worked in an organization where not only did they do that task, but then they also used that information to be able to look at potential staffing for new projects. So not only did they keep the employee information, they kept skill set information about the employees as well. So when they were looking to staff up new projects, they could take that information to look at potential candidates that they could use to staff up those projects. Okay, so that's a strategic, top-down kind of approach. The other way to go at these things is through a bottom-up approach. So that's more of a tactical automation consideration. Tends to be driven by the boots on the ground employees, the people that are actually involved in day-to-day tasks and line management associated with those. The goal here then really is process augmentation, allowing you to do things that you couldn't do before. And again, that taking that approach will help mitigate the doom and gloom of being automated out of a job that some people might take on that feeling. So with a bottoms-up approach, you probably want to start with something small and relatively simple, but obviously something that's going to have some sort of measurable gain. For example, maybe you're processing invoices that come in through paper-based or PDF-based mechanism. Maybe you could look at automating that instead of having a person sit there and type those into your financial system. Maybe you could automate that and have a machine do that instead. And that would then potentially improve accuracy and volume that you could process. The best approach, though, to be perfectly honest, is actually coming up with some sort of hybrid or harmonization between both approaches. You really want to take a people-first approach to any automation that you take on, because again, this is going to impact people, and as we discussed, people are going to have some sort of emotional reaction to that. So you definitely want to mitigate that process. So give equal measure to both the human aspect as well as the process aspect. You certainly want to keep humans in the loop as you go through and apply any automation. That's going to help you ensure that the processes can be optimized while the people focus on the things that matter. And that's generally going to result in better ideas coming from the folks involved. It's going to come with better implementation, and you're going to derive better value from that approach. All right, next slide. So some ways that you can tackle automation, some approaches. One approach is what we call rip and replace. So that's taking an existing process and completely overhauling that process. That might involve the IT systems that are involved, as well as the processes that surround that. That can be a daunting task. It looks like a large chunk of work that has to take place to make that happen. It's going to involve cost. It's going to involve time to implement. It's going to involve disruption whilst that process takes place. You have to keep the old process going whilst you're building the new process and getting it ready. And of course, it's going to involve risk as well. So a rip and replace approach, it can be more difficult to justify because of some of those reasons that we just talked about. And it can delay the time to providing that all-important measurable benefit as well. This is going to take a longer time to implement, and therefore it's going to take a longer time to get to the return on investment. Because of the risk and cost disruption and length of time, another way to approach an automation is through a layered approach. So in this case, this is taking an incremental approach to introducing automation, meaning you don't have to do everything in one giant step. Obviously, what's important here is that you have to identify the targets that you want to tackle. You've got to take into consideration any constraints around what you're trying to achieve. Those constraints might be budget, they might be technology-based, they might be people-based, they might be talent-based. Do you have the appropriate folks to be able to do this process? One thing that's important here, though, is to build on your successes. Once you've successfully taken on an automation task and it has proven successful, nothing's going to motivate you more than achieving that goal. But just as importantly, an approach may well fail. You might make a mistake. and therefore the automation is not successful. There are definitely valuable lessons to be learned in that process. But again, by taking an incremental approach, you are naturally limiting the scope of the automation that you're trying to tackle on, and therefore you're limiting the scope of any failures as well. So while a failure might indicate that a particular automation goal isn't achievable given your current constraints, it could also lead to exploration of alternative approaches as well. And then ultimately, you may well accomplish the desired automation outcome. All right, so next slide. All right, so I'd like to talk a little bit about one of our customers, which is Seiko Tools, that we worked on a project of automation with them. So the background to Seiko, they're a leading manufacturer of metal cutting tools for milling, stationary tools, hole making, and tooling systems. They provide the cutting tools that allow for the manufacture of a diverse range of products, from things like dentist drills to housings around jet engines. They tend to follow what's called a razor blade model. If you're familiar with the way Gillette works, they sell you the handle, and then you plug in the razor blades as they get used, and you replace them. So Seiko does the same kind of thing. They manufacture these cutting tools, but those cutting tools will wear out over time and need to be replaced. So those tools have an expected life, but there may be an occasion where a customer of Seiko might get an experience where the life of a cutting tool doesn't meet expectations. So one of the things Seiko does is they provide services to be able to investigate that type of outcome. It could well be that it was incorrect usage of the cutting tool or incorrect installation in the lathe that was used. It could be an issue with the material, or it could be a manufacturing defect by Seiko themselves. So they provide services to be able to white glove the customer and investigate why a tool might not have lived up to expectation. All right, so the particular problem that we were helping Seiko with, they had a catalog of tools and parts that they made available through the web. They used that information so that customers could download that and look at technical specifications and measurements of particular parts and tools. And they also used that information internally when they were building bills of materials documents for large customer projects. All right, so the problem here was that some of that information was obsolete up on the catalog, and it wasn't clear what was obsolete and what wasn't. And also the process of building these bills of materials was incredibly complicated when many parts and tools were involved, to the point where it could take weeks or months to put together a bill of materials for a large customer project, and that just was not competitive. In fact, they could decline some projects if Seiko realized that it would take them too long to come up with that type of information. And turning away business is never a good idea. All right, so let's go to the next page. So the online catalog that Seiko was using, it had about 150,000 parts. That information was stored in Azure Cloud. The files were in something called XML format. And as I said, it contained technical information, features, geometry, and it also contained a reference to another file, a computer-aided design file that a customer could download. So that information could be downloaded and plugged into a tool data management to ensure that that the part would fit into the customer's existing equipment, make sure that it could withstand tolerances, that it met specific KPIs. That's what all that information was for. So the original plan that Seiko was looking at to solve this this challenge was to consolidate all of this this tool and part information into a single central database. The approaches that they'd looked at, they came up with an estimate that it would take them about 3 years to accomplish that, and it would take additional staff resources as well. So bringing HULFT into the project and being able to review the requirements and look at ways that we could help them solve the problem, we were able to complete the project within budget and on time. We were able to complete the project in a matter of weeks as opposed to 3 years. Also, it didn't require any additional staff hires. Now that is not always the case with all customers. In Seiko's case, again, they offer a fairly technical product, and therefore the folks that they have on staff are fairly technical anyway. In their case, they were able to take the HULFT product, which in this case is HULFT Integrate. We were able to teach them how to use that tool, and they were able to take on the implementation of the project pretty much by themselves. They brought us in to do recommendations, reviews as they went through the process, but they were skilled enough that they could pick up the tool and do much of the work by themselves. That's not always the case with all customers, so we also have a professional services staff where we can bring in skilled IT experts to help with building projects as well. All right, so some of the things that we had to take into consideration with the approach that we took here, as I mentioned, the files were in XML format on Azure, as well as the CAD files that were also on Azure Cloud. One of the things we did is there was an Excel file that contained a master list of current part files. So one of the first steps in the process was to identify the parts that were obsolete and exclude those from further processing. Because there is a cost involved in both upload and download and processing within an Azure cloud, decision was made to pull all of the information locally and do that as one step, and then do all the processing against those files locally. And that was purely designed to keep the costs down. The processing that we did locally then was, as I mentioned, we discarded the obsolete parts. We then did some cleansing of the data, some rotation and tessellation of the parts data so that they were all in the same alignment. And then we were able to take that information and upload that into a tool data management central store, which again is just it's a fancy database, but it's specialized around handling parts. All right, so next slide, please. So some final thoughts about automation. So with automation, data integration is usually one of the steps, possibly one of the first steps towards achieving something bigger. For example, what was the the end goal for Seiko? The end goal for Seiko was to be able to produce those bills of materials in a quick fashion, so that they could be competitive and get the customer's business. Some other goals. We talked about the rip and replace versus the layered approach. So in the layered approach, you'll probably be looking at integrating existing technologies, potentially sometimes with new technologies. So you want to involve a system that can handle both of those scenarios, a system that's going to give you flexibility as you move forward through your automation. So integrating those new technologies with your existing systems is going to help you with tangible improvements for your organization. And then realize, of course, that data integration initiatives as part of your automation are going to incur costs. You'll need to decide resources for designing, maintaining, scaling those projects. How does your organization become into a data-driven culture? It's going to depend on stakeholders and leadership. And of course, we have to take into consideration the political aspects that are involved. It's not just technology, it's also people, politics, and emotions that are involved. The one key thing to remember, even with automation, is that robots can't handle the emotional and the political aspects of projects. That's always going to be something where humans are involved. All right. So at that point, then, I'd like to open things up for a Q&A, and we'll go through, and I'll take on any questions that folks have.
Thanks, Kevin. So we've had a few questions come through already. I don't know if you can see the screen, but I'll just read it out to you. So about the Seiko case study, it seems simple data conversion into main server. Any specific solution or efficiency over existing competitions?
Yes, so there were certainly considerations that we had to take in when we were looking at the automation project for Seiko. So some of the constraints were the fact that the information was stored in Azure. So that wasn't going to change. That was the starting point for us. So we had to have a technology that allowed us to connect to Azure and be able to bring the information down. Again, we discussed how we would tackle the process of eliminating the redundancies, the obsolete products and parts, and the fact that we would need to do some cleansing of the data to bring it into alignment. And again, with discussions with the customer, realizing that if we did that where the data was in situ in the cloud, that there were additional costs that they would incur because of the model that the cloud vendors use. So again, a decision was made in conjunction with the customer that to avoid those types of costs, that we would bring it locally. So that was another constraint that we had to work with. And then lastly, the target system where they wanted to put the information so they could use it to help build the bill of materials, the tool data management system, that had already been selected by Seiko before we got involved in the project. So again, we had to be able to work with that and ensure that we could get the data into that system. So those were some of the constraints that we had to work in and ensure success for the customer.
Thanks, Kevin. Another question is, can you please speak to how the use of standards can help along the automation journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of IT, the benefit of standards is really interoperability. And again, with data integration, that tends to be a big part of what you're trying to do. Interoperability gives you the ability to be able to communicate with different systems, whether you're reading data from a system or putting data into a system. So by following industry standards, that ensures that you have that interoperability and that you can connect and work with those systems. So it's very important that with any data integration technology, that you look at a tool that adheres to those standards and works with them.
Great. And we have one more minute left, and one last question. How do you evaluate cost as investment and output on this project?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
How do you evaluate cost as investment and output on this project?
So the big factor here was really the loss of business that Seiko was experiencing, especially with their larger customers. So they were not being competitive in terms of how long it took them to be able to produce the bill of materials for larger projects. And that would potentially turn customers to competitors. Not only that, as I mentioned, in certain cases, Seiko wouldn't even go down that path because they knew of the complexity involved in the project, that you know, they had cases where it could take them months to come up with the bill of material information to be able to provide that information to a prospect. So that just was not competitive in the marketplace. So that was the big driver, was seeing, you know, how much business that they lost, and then it was a case of looking at the process of modifying their processes, automating their processes so that they could come up with a solution that would allow them to be competitive, and then comparing the cost of implementing that solution to the gain that they would see, the ROI essentially that they would get from being able to work with their larger customers. So that was you know, a fairly early discussion that we had with Seiko. Well, that's part of the process that we do, is we look at their requirements, we come up with a plan of what we think it will take to be able to build a solution that will meet those requirements, and then we can come up with a cost estimate, and then that's a comparison against their potential loss of business and how soon will they get to an ROI from the solution.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So unfortunately, we're at the end of our 30 minutes. And as you can see, this is a pretty broad and complex topic, but I hope you were able to drive home some of the key points, which is that it's entirely possible to successfully launch automation initiatives even while you're working in legacy systems. It shouldn't overwhelm your budget, and it can be done on time, on budget, and it should be within your reach to design an approach that is realistic and scalable. With that, thank you again for your time. Please do remember to take a quick survey, which will be launched on your screen shortly. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact us. Kevin's email is below, and reach out to us if you have any further questions. Thank you again, and stay well, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.